great pleasure to introduce Francesca Harris, Fran. Um, she's governed by our lab and by her. So Fran is visiting us from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. She's a research assistant on the Chef's Project, which stands for, very cleverly stands for Sustainable and Healthy Food Systems. Um, Let me read out her formal bio. Um, so this is a Wellcome Trust funded project and explores the links between food, environment, and health in India, UK, and South Africa. And her PhD is focused on the links between water security and food consumption in India. So when this is, I think, Fran's second or third visit to ATREE, second visit to ATREE. She had come earlier as part of the initial chefs delegation. So chefs is a project that ATREE has joined recently. Um, and Alan Dango, her advisor, um, pulled me aside and said, please do take very good care of her. She's our star performer. And, and I think we've been failing in our duties to do that because this fan is just recovering from dengue. So, so I won't take too much of her time because even though she asked me to take up much of this time introducing her, I won't. I shall be me, and I shall let her talk. Also, she's a very good singer and dancer, and she wants to participate in next our next day at the university.
Is that better? Yeah. Yes, I will say because of that dengue, I also am a bit concerned about this talk. Some of you have seen it already because I skimmed over it earlier, but I was really not sure about the title either. So I've called it The Challenge of Sustainable Food Systems because I felt that I come from a public health nutrition background. So given that this is an environmental institution, I thought what would be interesting is to sort of explore some of the complexities that we discuss in public health nutrition, and also that have kind of become more and more popular at the moment within the sustainable food system research. So I'm going to slightly talk about my work in a bit, but also give an overview. My apologies if it's really basic. I couldn't quite judge the level that I should be putting everything at, but also if something is not understood, I really please just ask lots of questions. I really appreciate questions. So my talk, I'm just going to give an overview of what I mean by a food system and the different relationships that can interact with it. Then I'm going to discuss how sustainable the current food system is when we think about it, giving examples of the work that we've done and are doing in India. And then finally talk about the solution. And I wanted to end with a discussion. I've posed some points for discussion, but which of course you just not have those points at all. But I want to hear a lot about what you think is possible, what you think is likely in India, what do you think the challenges are here. So yeah, hopefully that can be quite interactive. So I'm going to start with the diet, because that's where my safe space is when we think about diet and how we consume and what we eat, that diet, that food, comes from food system activities. That can be agricultural production, that can be processing, manufacturing, all of those different activities that are within that food system. How we eat, what food that food system produces that we then consume, will impact our own individual health. But health of our own individual health can also impact on that food system. So if we're an agricultural worker, then if we are in poor health, that's going to impact on the ability of the food system to produce food. Policies will interact within this space too. So there are some policies that will be supportive of different elements of agricultural production, but also policies like nutrition guidelines or nutrition public health policies will support how we actually consume our diets too. Then, of course, there is the environment. So the environment will determine what food system activities can occur, so what different products will be produced in a certain area. But as I'll discuss later, and you obviously will know too, that the food system itself can interact with the environment. And on top of all of that, all of this can happen within different socio-economic and societal factors. So the extent of those relationships will vary depending on the context, depending on the culture, depending on the income is my framework that I'm going to use to discuss everything today, and I'm going to skim over the next few slides quite quickly because I hope that they'll be sort of common knowledge, but I feel like they're important to set the scene. What is a sustainable food system? I'm going to read this definition out because I don't know it. A food system that delivers security and nutrition to all in such a way that the economic, social, and environmental basis to generate food security and nutrition for future generations are not compromised. So within this definition of sustainability, we already have not just the environmental sustainability, but we have the impacts on health and nutrition and food security, the economic and the social side, but also making sure that whatever we do now doesn't compromise the ability of future generations to achieve what we have. So in that context, we're going to think about whether the current food system globally and in India is sustainable. The first relationship I wanted to discuss was one between what food our food system is producing and how we're consuming it and what impact that is having on our health. Not too great. Poor diets are the leading risk factor for mortality globally. So 1 in 5 deaths is associated with a poor diet across the world. The main risk factor is diets high in sodium, but there's also things like diets low in whole grain, fruits and vegetables, fiber, and all sorts of other factors. The reasons behind this all vary in different contexts. So, for example, in low-income countries, there's evidence to suggest that eating 3 portions of vegetables and 2 portions of fruit a day would cost you 50% of your income. So it's unrealistic that we would expect these people to be able to afford a healthy diet. But that's also, but undernutrition is also increasing from other regions around the world. So last year, or the last 2 years now actually, I think, undernutrition has been on the rise, with roughly 800 million people in the world are undernourished. And there's some evidence that that's partially to do with extreme climate change events occurring. Additionally, there's also an increase in the last, since 1975, in the rates of obesity globally. Around 13% is global. This has occurred in North America and Europe and Oceania, but even in Asia, there's been in recent years a 7% increase. Sorry, a 7% increase over time, but the rate has dramatically increased in recent years. Which brings me on to nutrition in India. India has the highest number of children that are stunted. That means that they're chronically undernourished and living and they grow short for their age. But there's also a high population of children who are wasted, which means that they don't have sufficient food in a short amount of time. And there's some evidence that obesity is increasing in children too. We call this, in public health terms, we call this the nutrition transition, which is what occurs in a lot of middle-income countries. Oh, excuse me. I'm not sure if that's middle-income countries and developing countries where there's an increase in the consumption of sugar, fat, salt, away from what we would call traditional diets. And part of this is to do with an influx in American brands. So this was just, I took this picture in Odisha of Subway and Domino's, and these are American brands that are coming into India and like many countries all over the world. That's causing a change in people's consumption patterns. India now, even still, has the #1 underweight population in the world, but it's also with the within the top 5 of obesity. So this problem means it's called the double burden of malnutrition when you have some of the population living in a state of undernutrition, insufficient calories, and some of the population living in a state of overnutrition. It causes a very big problem in terms of policies and what you do about it, because obviously those are different systems and different issues that need to be tackled. So from that very brief introduction, you can kind of see that perhaps our food system at the moment isn't that sustainable in terms of health factors. But the food system is also having an impact on the environment. Globally, green agriculture is the second most emitting sector over industry and transportation. This is due to various different stages. I'm going to skim through this quite quickly because I presume people know about it, but various different causes on farm, so methane emitted through ruminants in their production, but fertilizer use as well, or agricultural burning. The IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, released a report a couple of weeks ago, and within that they estimate that the food system, so including the pre- and post-production, not just on farm, could have an environmental impact of 21 to 30, could have a greenhouse gas emission impact of 21 to 37% of all of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. So our food is really responsible for a lot of carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions. Excuse me. Additionally, and this is something that a lot of people here will probably know way more about this than me, but additionally, agriculture is a major driver for land use change and biodiversity loss. Some of the deforestation that's occurring right now in the Amazon, with estimates showing it's about 65% of deforestation in the Amazon is related to cattle ranching alone. Additionally, agriculture accounts for 70% of water withdrawals, so far more than the industrial and domestic sectors. In India, it's actually higher than the global average. Around 91% of the water withdrawals are for agriculture specifically. And this is obviously leading to serious concerns around water security. This is an estimate called water stress, and I'm not really sure if I'm a fan of it, but it at least demonstrates that there's a significant problem in a lot of India around availability of water resources. So our food system, in summary, is impacting on both our health, but also our diets, the environment. And the actual diets we're consuming through that food system can have differential impacts on the environment. So we carried out a review a few years ago now into all of the studies that had looked at the environmental impacts of diets, and compared to a Western pattern, healthier dietary guidelines, if everyone ate healthier dietary guidelines, that would result in a reduction in the greenhouse gas emissions, the land use required, and the water use required to produce those diets. If people were to consume a vegetarian diet, so that's, for us, vegetarian would mean still eating milk and eggs, that would reduce this even further. But I would point out that this is from a Western context, and therefore those changes will be different depending on what the original baseline diet is. There's also differences in the environmental impact of diets, not just because of how people consume or the pattern of that consumption, but also because of where they're consuming it. This is a review that's just got accepted for looking at total dietary water footprints all over the world and all the studies that have analysed this. The water footprint, for people that don't know, is a measure of the volume of rainwater incorporated into a product if it's called the green water footprint, or the volume of ground and surface water incorporated into a product if it's called the blue water footprint. And the range, by the way, was between around 1,500 litres per capita per day for the production of diets in some parts of Africa. And this goes up to over 8,000 litres of water required to produce diets in certain regions of the world. So there's a massive disparity. But one thing I wanted to point out, if I can point, I can't. Is, as you can see here, Asia is really dominating in terms of how it's using its blue water. So compared to the rest of the world, Asia uses a lot more irrigation to produce its diet. Various reasons behind that, of course, but when we look at India specifically and compare to a European reference diet, so that's how we're currently consuming in Europe, versus a European vegetarian diet, so a pattern that you would say might be more similar to the average in India, you can see that the blue water use is much higher, nearly 3 times higher, although the total water use is less. So my point from all of this is to explain that not only is your diet pattern responsible for differential environmental impacts, but also where you're consuming it and the context will have an impact too. Unfortunately, the environment itself can also come back and impact on the food system. So climate change predicted to impact on cereal yields. This will estimate to have another 500,000 deaths per year by 2050, just due to a loss in that production. Climate change is also estimated to impact cereal quality, so not only the quantity that's being produced, but the actual nutrients that are contained within the crops. And you can see India is one of the areas of high concern in terms of iron, protein, and zinc content of cereals. Furthermore, it's not just about the nutrition, but as I mentioned earlier, the impact of health on people that are working within the food system activities is important. So This is a map demonstrating the density of people working in agriculture against blue water scarcity. And you can see a lot of the major food-producing regions of the world are high in terms of their agricultural employment. So there's a risk there for food security as well. Finally, and apologies for the whistle-stop tour around it, there's also policies that interact within this space. So policies can impact on each of these, and I'm going to just give, obviously, a very brief overview because it's not the aim of my talk. But one example of policies that will change this system is the Sustainable Development Goals. We all know what they are and what they do, and obviously there's various different ones of these that could interact within this system. But a policy that we don't usually think about when we think about environmental impacts is food trade, or the presence of food trade. Globally, food trade in the last 50 years has dramatically increased, partially due to trade barriers being dropped or different tariffs being changed, et cetera, et cetera. And so actually, when you think about an individual's environmental impact in a country, you not only have to think about their impacts locally, but also from their food that they're importing. Carol Dallin, one of our colleagues working on the Chefs Project, did an analysis a few years ago, like a year ago maybe, on the groundwater that's exported, embedded groundwater depletion that's exported through food items due to international food trade. So just because a country is exporting its water, how much groundwater depletion is contained within those exports of that food product. And sorry for those at the back, it's not the clearest map in the world, but I just wanted to use it to illustrate that India, here, USA, and Pakistan account for the three major groundwater depletion exporters globally. So given that context, one major part of our work was to explore what the actual trade impacts were within India itself. And unfortunately, so I wanted to, the aim was to look at interstate trade, and so therefore what the impact of a consumer in one state might be having on another state. Unfortunately, there's no data on interstate trade, or at least the totality of interstate trade of food products within India at the moment. And so one big part of my PhD, and this is something that I'm quite keen to hear your thoughts on at least, is to explore how trade patterns might occur. And there's various different methods for doing this, but I did some research into what might be possible. One is that you have some existing model data that you can look forward to, but we didn't have any of that. So what I did was do a supply and demand balance, where basically you take the total amount of cereals that are consumed within a state, total amount of cereals that are produced in the state, total amount of cereals that are consumed in the state, and work out what the difference is, and therefore who requires more and who requires less. For this analysis, and for this analysis at least, I have not included the public distribution system because that's completely, the way that that's managed is completely separate. So I just wanted to explore how different cereal trade might occur, not included in the public distribution system. I then assigned water use to that cereal production, and we've had some, we published earlier this year some new data on the water footprints at state level for different cereal crops in India. And using estimates for irrigation source for different states provided by the government, I then separated out how much ground and surface water might be used and transported through cereal trade. This is when the modelling bit gets all modelling language, but then I used an optimization model to predict the direction of those trade flows based on minimizing the cost of transportation. If anyone is interested or has any experience in trade and wants to just really talk to me about that, that would be hugely appreciated because it's not my area of expertise, but that's what I've done. And then finally, based on that model, calculate the flows of water. This is some preliminary results. I've mapped the status of groundwater depletion based on government's estimates, along with how cereals are being exported. So the colour of the chord is based on the exporting state, and the indentations are where the cereals are being imported. And this includes rice, wheat, sorghum, millet, and maize. And you can see that Punjab, Haryana, obviously it's not particularly new, sorry, that they're overexploited, but they're massively exporting their groundwater depletion to some states, particularly states like Maharashtra, they're vulnerable in their future cereal supply because they're importing a lot of those cereals produced from overexploited groundwater. Actually, it was around 33% of all cereal exports were coming from states with groundwater depletion. And if you've included semi-critical and critical states, it went up to about 66%. So this is a work in progress, but I'm merely using it here to demonstrate that if we just think about the environmental impact of food and we don't account for different policies or interactions that might be having and relationships that might be occurring, then we'll miss out some of those important relationships and won't necessarily do a sufficient risk assessment. How am I doing for time, by the way? Okay. So, given all of that, it's complicated, and sorry I've skimmed over everything quite quickly, but because of these interactions existing, what I wanted to now show was that that means there's solutions that can obviously occur within each of those spaces too. So we'll start with diet, which I indicated to earlier. Dietary change is potentially one of the major ways that we could actually reduce our environmental impact, but this will depend on the socioeconomic and societal factors that are already existing. So in Western contexts, we definitely need to reduce our meat consumption. It's already way too high anyway, but we need to, it's the major story. All we hear about is reducing meat consumption and animal source food consumption in order to reduce our environmental impact. But the world eats very different diets. These are just pictures, sorry, they're not that big, I could have made them a bit bigger, of what a family eats in 1 week in different countries. And you can see all over the world, everyone has a different style of food. They will eat different types of food in different quantities. And so these social and cultural elements are really important to maintain. But there's also different requirements based on the health needs. Sorry for the people at the back, it's quite small. But I'm going to just demonstrate here, these are different food groups, and the dotted line demonstrates where the recommended amount would be in order to suffice with nutritional recommendations. And you can see some countries, so North America is in purple here with massively overeating and its red meat consumption, whereas in sub-Saharan Africa, starchy vegetables are way too high, and that's potentially because there isn't sufficient number of diverse foods available. But in all countries, regions, we're all eating far less fruits and vegetables, legumes, whole grains and nuts than we should be. So we wanted to look at India and specifically what could be done in India. In order to do this, we had to understand how people were eating different diets. And we found a data set that was used it's called the Indian Migration Study, and it had around 7,000 individuals in it. I would say that this was a data set of fairly wealthy adults in India, so our solutions will reflect that, and therefore perhaps don't estimate exactly what we would need to, or India potentially would need to do in order to reduce environmental impacts. These were the different dietary patterns that we identified in our data set, and the general sort of consensus was that there was definitely, in the north, there were wheat-based patterns, whereas in the south there was much more rice-based patterns. These are named by the main cereal that was consumed within the diet and one other identifying factor. The rice and meat pattern, interestingly, didn't really have a regional association, but was just more consumed by younger populations in India. So we looked at these diet patterns and said, what is their environmental impact? And firstly, you can see that different patterns have different environmental impacts because obviously they're consuming different amounts of food. But what was interesting was when we compared to the UK, greenhouse gas emissions were much lower than what the UK average was, but the blue water footprints, as we kind of thought would happen, was much higher. So we said with this context that diets are consuming a lot more blue water, why don't we look at how we could reduce the amount of blue water that's being used by those diets while improving health? Just a note on what the current water footprints of Indian food items are. Fruits and vegetables are much lower in their total water requirements. That's both blue and green, so rainfall and irrigation water use. Poultry products are actually